The last words he ever said to me were, "You won't even notice the money is gone." 30 years have passed, and they still ring in my ears with the same cold casualness, as if he had been commenting on the weather and not stealing the life I had. Spent decades stitching together out of double shifts, early mornings, and the quiet discipline of a woman who believed that saving meant safety. I remember the way he said it, soft, almost embarrassed, like he wanted it to sound like a joke, like he wanted to believe I would laugh with him and not feel the floor tilt under my feet. Back then I was 62, still strong enough to carry groceries in both hands, still naive enough to think a mother could be immune to her child's betrayal, still foolish enough to believe that love guarantees loyalty. Now I am 82, and my hands tremble when I button my blouse, and my knees creak before I even stand. And sometimes when I'm alone in this small apartment with its peeling paint and stubborn window blinds, I whisper those words aloud just to remind myself that they really happened, that I didn't imagine the moment my life cracked open, because it's strange how a betrayal that massive can, over time, begin to feel like a dream you had long ago. You remember the outline, the sting, the terrible knowledge, but the details blur, the edges soften, and sometimes you almost convince yourself it was never quite that bad, until the knock at the door shatters the distance and drags the past back into the room like an unwanted ghost pulling up a chair at your table. I live quietly now, quieter than anyone deserves to live, after giving so much of myself to a son who took everything in return. The neighbors think I'm simply an old woman whose family lives far away, and I let them believe it because it's easier than telling them the truth. That I once had a son who emptied my accounts, vanished into a city whose name I never learned, and left me behind with nothing but the echo of his apology that never came. For years, I filled the silence with routine. Mornings spent wiping down the kitchen counter even when it was already clean. Afternoons spent sitting by the window with the Arizona light pressing hot and heavy across my lap. Evenings steeped in the mechanical sound of the old wall unit air conditioner that rattled like an aging heart. I told people I enjoyed the solitude, but the truth is that I simply grew accustomed to the absence, the way someone grows accustomed to chronic pain. It becomes part of the body, part of the breathing, part of the identity. You stop asking for relief. You stop asking for anything. I never remarried after my husband died, partly because no one came along, but mostly because I didn't want to risk being needed and then discarded again. I had loved enough for one lifetime. I had done enough forgiving. And so the years passed, one folding into the next like clean sheets stacked in a linen closet, neat but stiff, orderly but lifeless. I made my own meals, watered the stubborn plants that refused to bloom, and spoke to no one except the cashier at the small grocery store who always called me Han, in a way that made me feel both seen and invisible at the same time. I learned to take up as little space as possible. I learned to vanish politely. And maybe, in some quiet corner of my mind, I learned to believe that I deserved it, that a woman who raises a son capable of such cruelty must have failed in ways that cannot be undone. And then yesterday, just as the evening light began to soften into that dusty gold that makes Arizona feel like a half-remembered dream, I heard a knock at my door. Not the sharp, impatient knock of a delivery man, or the awkward double tap of a neighbor with a package meant for someone else, but a hesitant, uneven sound, like the person on the other side wasn't sure they had the right address. I almost didn't answer. After so many years of living inside my own silence, I've grown wary of interruptions, wary of voices, wary of anything that might stir the sediment at the bottom of my heart. But something in the air shifted, something fragile and electric, and before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the door. She stood there like a question, written in trembling handwriting. A young woman in her 20s, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled into a loose knot and eyes so wide they seemed almost too young to hold the weight she was carrying. She clutched a worn envelope in one hand and a faded photograph in the other, and when she looked at me, really looked at me, it felt like the world paused, like even the evening wind held its breath. "Are you Margaret?" she asked in a voice that cracked on the second syllable. Not from fear, but from something deeper, something that made my heart shift in my chest like old furniture being moved. I nodded, confused, already feeling an ache I couldn't yet name. Then she lifted the photograph, an old, sun-bleached picture of my son when he was still young enough to smile without regret. And she said the sentence that folded 30 years of pain into a single, shattering moment. "I think you're my grandmother." And in that instant, I swear, something inside me, something I thought had died decades ago, opened its eyes. When she stepped over the threshold and into my dimly lit living room, the first thing I noticed was how tightly she held that envelope, as if it were the rail of a ship in rough water, something she needed to grip just to keep from swaying. I gestured for her to sit, and she hesitated for a moment, scanning the room like someone stepping into a memory they didn't know they carried. And then she settled onto the edge of the sofa with a kind of careful reverence that made me suddenly aware of the thinness of the cushions, the fading upholstery, the smallness of the life I had built after everything fell apart. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. She stared at her hands, and I stared at her face, trying to understand how a stranger could hold features that were both unfamiliar and painfully known, echoes of the boy I once tucked into bed and the man who walked out of my life without looking back. I felt my pulse in my throat, slow and heavy, like a warning beat. When she finally lifted her eyes to mine, I saw a tremor of fear there. Not fear of me, but fear of the truth she had brought with her, the truth she could no longer outrun. She said her name, Lily, and the syllables floated through the room like a fragile offering. Then, after another silence that stretched long enough for me to feel the weight of decades pressing down, she slid the envelope toward me with both hands, as if it were something sacred. I didn't reach for it at first. I just sat there, feeling the old instinct rise in me, the instinct to brace myself, the same way I used to brace when the phone rang in the days after my son disappeared, when every call felt like it might be the one that explained everything or destroyed what little peace I had left. "It was in his things," she said finally, her voice low and uneven. "At the place where he spent his last months." Her fingers twisted slightly in her lap as she added, "He kept this envelope separate from the rest, wrapped in a shirt, like he didn't want it to get lost." The words hit me harder than they should have. My son had always been careless with his belongings, tossing them on chairs, leaving them in cars, losing jackets, misplacing wallets. But the thought of him folding a shirt around an envelope with my name on it, was almost too much to process. I reached for it then, slowly, as though it might crumble at my touch, and the paper felt softer than I expected, worn at the edges, slightly creased as if handled many times. My name was written on the front in a shaky hand that wasn't quite his, but wasn't a stranger's either. A handwriting softened by illness or exhaustion or regret. I couldn't tell which. I didn't open it yet. I couldn't. My heart had started hammering in my chest with a force that reminded me of the night he disappeared, the night I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off and waited for a sound that never came. Lily watched me with a gentleness that made something inside me ache. "I don't know him," she said, and there was no bitterness in her voice, only a tired honesty. "I never met him. My mother didn't talk about him. She said he was complicated, and that was the only word she ever used." She swallowed hard, then added, "He left before I was born." I felt a sharp, familiar pain then, a wound reopening, not because I was surprised, but because there was something unbearably cruel about the idea that he had abandoned more than just me, that he had left a child too, a child who was now sitting in my living room searching for answers I didn't have. "He never told you about me," she continued, "but before he died, he wrote something, a letter. He didn't finish it. He didn't even seal it. It was inside the envelope." She looked down again, blinking rapidly the way people do when they are fighting back tears they don't want to offer to the wrong person. "I almost didn't come. I thought maybe you wouldn't want to know. Or maybe you already knew and didn't care." Her voice broke a little on the last word. I finally opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded twice, the creases soft from being opened and closed, who knows how many times. His handwriting, or what was left of it, sprawled across the page in uneven strokes, some letters dark and certain, others faint as a whisper. There were sentences scratched out, whole lines rewritten, apologies that began and stopped mid-word as if he didn't know how to finish them. He wrote that he was sorry, that he had planned to come back, that he hadn't meant to take everything, that he had been scared and ashamed and convinced that I would never forgive him, and that every year it became harder to return because the weight of his failure grew heavier than his hope. But the line that broke me, the one that pierced the old armor I had layered over my chest, was the one near the bottom where his writing slanted sharply downward, as if his hand had slipped. "I kept thinking one day I'd bring it all back, Mom. All of it, but I never learned how to stop running." I stared at those words until they blurred, until the room around me tilted slightly, and Lily's voice felt as though it were coming from somewhere far away. The betrayal I had carried for 30 years, the betrayal that shaped the rest of my life, suddenly felt different. Not smaller, not excused, but rooted in a kind of brokenness I had refused to imagine. A brokenness that did not erase what he did, but made it unbearably human. I felt grief rise in me like a slow tide, not loud or frantic, but heavy and unstoppable. The kind of grief that comes not from the wound itself, but from finally understanding the depth of the wound after decades of pretending it didn't bleed anymore. When I looked up at Lily, her face was full of a hesitant hope, like she was waiting for a verdict she already feared. I folded the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with a tenderness I didn't know I still possessed, and placed it on the coffee table between us. My hands trembled, but I didn't hide it. "Tell me everything you know," I whispered, and my voice sounded older than I felt, older than the years I had lived. Because in that moment, with the past spread open in front of me, with the child of my child sitting across from me like a living question, I understood that this was the hinge on which everything would turn. This was the moment, the quiet, ordered Life I had built would either collapse or begin again. And that was the exact instant I realized something else, something terrifying and undeniable. No matter what she told me next, nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a moment. Instead, I lay in the dark with the letter spread open beside me on the small wooden table where I usually kept my reading glasses and the bottle of night cream I often forgot to use. And the silence in the room felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening to my breathing and waiting for me to break in some familiar, predictable way. But I didn't cry. I didn't move. I simply lay there, letting the slow ache of recognition settle into my bones. An ache that wasn't as sharp as the pain I remembered from 30 years ago, but deeper, older, the kind that doesn't stab so much as press steadily from the inside, reshaping the contours of your chest until you feel like someone new might emerge from your own skin. It's strange to realize how grief evolves. In youth, it arrives like fire, loud and devouring, but in old age it comes like sediment, layer upon layer of quiet weight, each memory a grain of sand that settles onto your heart until you cannot distinguish where the original wound ends and the years of silence begin. By morning, the letter felt almost like an item from someone else's life, an artifact of a grief I had learned to fold neatly into the gaps of my days. Yet when I held it again, the paper still warm from the bedside lamp I had left on through the night. It felt so intimate that my fingers hesitated as though they were touching skin. I sat down in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that tasted more bitter than usual, though I suspect it wasn't the coffee, but the way my senses had sharpened under the weight of what Lily had told me, what she had dared to bring into a life that had been still for far too long. The morning light streamed in through the blinds in narrow golden stripes that cut across the table and the letter, and for a moment I couldn't look away from the pattern. Light and shadow, because it resembled the way memory had carved itself into me for decades, always alternating between what I allowed myself to see and what I trained myself to forget. The house felt different after her visit. The air was restless, as if someone had opened all the windows in the night, letting in a wind that unsettled objects I hadn't touched in years. I moved through the rooms without purpose, reaching out to steady myself on the edges of chairs and countertops, as though the floor had loosened under me. I kept waiting for the familiar numbness to slip back into place, the numbness I had worn like a second skin for so long, but it didn't return. Instead, I felt a strange alertness, a fragile awareness of my own breathing, my own heartbeat, my own pulse rushing beneath my skin like something waking after a long sleep. For the first time in decades, I was not only remembering my son, I was remembering myself. Yet with that awareness came the quiet escalation I had not anticipated, the slow unraveling of the life I had kept carefully contained. It began in small ways, almost unnoticeable at first, like the way my hands trembled when I washed the dishes, or how I found myself standing in front of the window longer than necessary, searching the street for her silhouette, even though I knew she wasn't coming back that day. I moved objects around my apartment, an old photograph frame, a dried rose, a jar of buttons my husband had collected, without understanding why I was touching them at all. And each time I set something down, I felt as though I were disturbing the dust. That time had so patiently settled. Later that afternoon, when the heat rose in its usual relentless Arizona way, I walked outside for the first time in a week, unable to bear the weight of the stillness any longer. The air felt thick and sharp, the kind that makes your lungs work harder, and I found myself heading toward the small park down the street. A place I rarely visited because I disliked watching families move easily around one another in ways mine never had. As I walked, the letter remained folded in my pocket, its presence a quiet pulse against my hip. And though I didn't touch it, I felt its memory pressing through the fabric, like a reminder that something long buried had begun to surface. At the park, I sat on a metal bench warmed by the sun and watched a young mother push her toddler on a swing, her hair pulled back messily, her shirt stained with something sticky and mundane. And I was struck by the unguarded tenderness in her movements, the way she leaned close every time the swing returned to her, the way her laughter rose without hesitation. I realized, watching her, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be part of those small, unintentional displays of affection, the kind that weave themselves into a family without anyone noticing. Perhaps that was the first sign that the ground beneath me was shifting, not Lily's visit itself, but the sudden awareness of all the things I had missed while surviving the aftermath of my son's choices. When I returned home, the apartment felt even smaller than before, as if the walls had tightened around me, anxious to return me to the life I had carefully narrowed for myself. But the letter on the table kept drawing my attention back, its edges curling slightly in the dry air, and before I even realized what I was doing, I sat down again, opened it, and read it from beginning to end, slowly, painfully, forcing each word to settle into place rather than skimming past the parts I didn't want to face. And something in me shifted then, something subtle but irrevocable. I felt anger, not the sharp anger of abandonment that had once burned through me, but a quieter, more insidious form of anger, anger at myself for letting the betrayal define the rest of my life, for letting the silence carry more weight than the truth ever could. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the apartment filled with that faint orange glow that always made me feel older than my years, I found myself replaying every detail of Lily's visit, every word she spoke, every tremor in her voice, every moment she hesitated before telling me something harder than the last. I realized she wasn't just delivering a letter. She was delivering a life I had refused to imagine existed, a life that had been growing quietly in the shadow of the man who had once been my son. And with that realization came a slow, creeping sense of responsibility, the kind that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't wait for acceptance. It simply arrives and settles deeply, insisting that you confront the pieces of yourself you thought were long gone. By the time darkness covered the room and I switched on the lamp beside my armchair, I understood that something had begun to unravel inside me. Something I couldn't stop even if I wanted to. The careful boundaries I had built around my heart, the routines that had kept me safe, the silence I had mastered so thoroughly, they were all beginning to fracture. Not dramatically, not with any visible collapse, but with the quiet persistence of a hairline crack that spreads almost imperceptibly until the entire surface is changed. And although I didn't yet know what would follow, I knew that nothing in my life would remain untouched. Not after her knock. Not after the letter. Not after the truth I had spent 30 years avoiding finally pushed its way back into my hands. I woke the next morning with a strange steadiness inside me. Not calm exactly, but a kind of quiet resolve, the kind that settles into the bones before the mind has time to understand where it came from. And as I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling the stiffness in my joints, and the familiar ache in my lower back. I realized that something in me had crossed an unseen threshold during the night. It wasn't hope, not yet. And it wasn't forgiveness, certainly not that. It was something smaller, something wiser. As if a door that had been locked for decades had rusted just enough to shift a fraction of an inch, reminding me that doors, even the oldest, even the most forgotten, can still move. I made coffee and stood by the window while it brewed, watching the early light stretch across the houses on my street. And for the first time in years, I noticed how quiet the morning was. Not the lonely quiet I had grown used to, but a softer kind. The quiet of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to entertain. The letter lay folded on the kitchen table, exactly where I had left it. But instead of avoiding it, I found myself drawn to it, not because I wanted to reread the words, but because the presence of it had become a reminder that my life, which I had assumed was already written to its final page, might have one more chapter I had not expected. It was strange to dress that morning, to put on my shoes and comb my hair with the awareness that I wasn't preparing for some mundane task, but for a kind of internal shift that had nothing to do with errands or routine. I didn't know what I was doing. I only knew that standing still felt impossible. So I left the house and walked toward the bus stop, my steps slow but purposeful, and boarded the nearly empty morning route that passed the edges of downtown. I didn't have a destination. I let the city move past me in long, unbroken stretches, letting the motion settle my thoughts the way rocking can soothe a restless child. I watched people on the sidewalks, young parents tugging toddlers along, office workers clutching travel mugs, students with backpacks too big for their shoulders. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a ghost among the living. I felt like someone re-entering a world she had quietly stepped out of years ago. When I finally stepped off the bus, I found myself standing near the library, an old building with wide stone steps and heavy wooden doors that creaked the way doors should. I hadn't been inside in at least a decade, not since my eyesight had worsened and I'd grown embarrassed about squinting at the checkout desk. But something about the place felt right, like a place to catch my breath. I walked inside, inhaled that familiar scent of paper and dust and quiet, and felt something inside me relax, as if the past couldn't hurt as sharply in a place devoted to stories. I wandered between the stacks, tracing my fingers lightly along the books without pulling any of them down, and found a corner table near the window where a dusty pot of artificial flowers sat, forgotten and crooked. I sat there for what felt like a long time, watching the dust float through the sunbeams, and realized that the heaviness in my chest was not sadness, but readiness. The readiness to stop living inside a wound. For 30 years, I had assumed that staying still meant staying safe. I had convinced myself that silence was the only shield I had left, that moving forward meant betraying the version of myself who had been abandoned so suddenly, so brutally. But sitting there in that warm, dusty corner, surrounded by stories of people who had lost and found and broken and rebuilt, I understood that I wasn't protecting myself by staying in the past. I was burying myself in it. The letter hadn't given me closure. It had given me permission. Permission to look beyond the frozen memory of the night he disappeared. Permission to imagine that the harm done to me did not have to define the rest of my life. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was the smallest, most fragile shift. The realization that I could move. I left the library and walked down the street to a small diner I hadn't visited since before my son vanished. Back then, I had come here once a week for pancakes and weak coffee. sitting in the corner booth while listening to the clatter of plates and the low hum of conversation that made me feel briefly connected to the world. I sat at the same booth now, though the upholstery was cracked and two of the blinds hung crookedly. The waitress, a woman about my age with kind eyes, approached with a notepad and a faint smile, and when she spoke, her voice was warm in a way I hadn't felt directed toward me in a long time. I ordered coffee and oatmeal, though I wasn't hungry. I just needed to feel the normalcy of a meal served by someone who didn't know anything about me. As I sat there, watching the steam rise from the mug, I felt an unexpected steadiness, as if my life had widened just slightly, allowing room for something other than old disappointment. On the bus ride home, I felt the letter in my bag shift with the motion of the vehicle, and I placed my hand over it, not as a gesture of grief, but of ownership. For decades, I had let the absence of answers define me, let the unanswered questions bruise every corner of my life. But now I understood something simple and profound. The answers had never been the point. What I needed was permission to live without them. And Lily, without even meaning to, had placed that permission into my hands the moment she said the words that had transformed the air around us. I think you're my grandmother. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a demand. It was a possibility. When I reached my house again, the afternoon sun had settled low, spreading a warm amber glow across the living room. I sat in my old armchair, the spring sighing beneath me, and stared at the quiet space that had held my loneliness for so many years. But today it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a place I could leave whenever I chose. The shift inside me was not loud or dramatic. It was subtle, like the moment when winter sunlight finally brightens enough to hint at spring. I didn't know what I would do next, not fully, but for the first time in 30 years, the future did not terrify me. It felt open, wide enough for me to take one step, then another, and then another still. I placed the letter back on the table, folded my hands in my lap, and took a long, slow breath. Something had begun, something I could not yet name, something that might change everything. I spent the next few days drifting through my routines with a strange, deliberate slowness, as though moving too quickly might disturb the fragile balance I had found after Lily's visit. A balance I didn't yet understand, but knew I couldn't afford to lose. What surprised me most was how quietly the change settled into me. It wasn't a revelation or a burst of courage, but a steady, creeping shift in the way I looked at everything around me. A shift I didn't invite, but didn't resist either. The letter remained on the kitchen table like an anchor I kept circling back to, each glance reminding me that something in my story had reopened, not painfully, but insistently, as if the past had decided it was time to finish a conversation it had started decades before. I found myself reading the letter at odd hours, tracing the uneven handwriting, lingering on the parts that felt unfinished, trying to hear the voice of the man my son had once been, and the man he never managed to become. Sometimes I felt tenderness, sometimes frustration, sometimes nothing at all, and those fluctuations left me more unsettled than any single emotion could have. It was on the fourth morning that the world outside began to intrude in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had just finished sweeping the small walkway leading to my front door when I saw an envelope tucked clumsily into the screen door, the kind of envelope that didn't arrive by mail, but was delivered by a hand, unsure of whether it should knock or flee. There was no name on the front, just a slight smudge where someone had hesitated before writing anything at all. I opened it inside the house, standing by the kitchen counter the way I always do when I'm preparing myself for something that might sting. and found a single sheet of paper with Lily's handwriting. It wasn't a letter, not really, more like a confession cut into fragments. She wrote that she hadn't told me everything, that there were details about her father's last days that she hadn't known how to say out loud, that she was afraid of hurting me, afraid of burdening me with something I had not asked for. She wrote that she needed time to collect herself, to decide whether the full truth would help me or shatter me, and that if I wanted her to return, she would come, but she would also understand if silence felt easier. I sat at the table with that note in my hand and felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not pain, exactly, but the sense that equilibrium had been disturbed again, that the past was not finished revealing itself, and that the next revelation would require more from me than I had expected. I folded the note carefully, placed it next to my son's letter, and stared at the two pieces of paper like they were partners in a conversation I had not yet been invited into. For a long while, I simply sat there, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the ticking of the old wall clock, and I realized that I no longer felt paralyzed by the thought of the past returning. Instead, I felt something sharper, something closer to dread than fear, because the truth Lily had withheld was clearly not small, and I was old enough to know that withheld truths rarely contain anything gentle. Later that day, just as the sun reached its highest point and the heat settled heavily on the windows, I heard the sound of footsteps on my porch, slow, hesitant, accompanied by a soft rustling that made me think someone was standing there, shifting their weight from foot to foot, unsure of whether to knock. When I opened the door, I didn't find Lily. Instead, I saw a man in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, his shirt wrinkled, a frown carved deeply into the lines of his face. He introduced himself quietly, saying his name was Raymond, and before I could place it, he added that he had known my son during the last year of his life. The shock of that statement caught in my throat, tightening it so abruptly I struggled to speak. He explained that he had been a volunteer at the shelter where my son had stayed, and that he had recognized my name from a file that contained emergency contacts that had never been updated. He asked if he could come in, and though instinctively I wanted to say no, to keep the boundary between my life and my son's final years intact, something in his voice made it impossible to refuse. It was the voice of someone who had witnessed suffering and carried the memory of it with solemn weight. The voice of someone who didn't come to offer comfort or judgment, but simply to speak what needed to be spoken. I let him sit at the kitchen table, the place where every truth in my life seems to land eventually, and listened as he told me pieces of my son's story I had never known, pieces that cracked the thin shell of distance I had built around myself. He told me my son had been sick for a long time, long before he sought help, and that he had resisted assistance with a stubbornness that reminded me painfully of his younger years, when he hated being told what to do. He told me there had been attempts at sobriety, attempts at work, attempts at rebuilding a life, but they always faltered, not because he didn't care, but because he carried a shame so deep that it swallowed every step he took forward. "He talked about you," the man said, and those words alone were enough to make my hands tremble. A lot, more than anything else. He thought you hated him. He thought he had ruined you. I felt something inside me constrict at that, not because the idea was entirely untrue, but because it revealed a chasm between us I hadn't known how to cross even when he was still alive. Then the man said something that made the room feel suddenly smaller, the air tighter, as if we had both stepped into a memory too heavy for two people to hold. He said my son had tried to send the letter several times, had even walked to a mailbox with the envelope in his hand, but each time he turned back, too afraid to commit his apology to the permanence of distance. He said my son kept the letter close to him, sometimes under his pillow, sometimes in the pocket of his coat, as though holding it could protect him from the fear of facing me again. He said my son died quietly, without drama, without last words, without revelation, just a slow fading, as though his heart had grown tired of waiting for the life he kept meaning to begin. After the man left, I felt myself collapse inward, not physically but emotionally, folding into an ache that did not resemble the sharp grief of years past, but something deeper and far more complicated. I had expected anger, expected bitterness, expected the old familiar resentment to rise again. But instead, I felt something like sorrow, mixed with resignation. The kind of sorrow that acknowledges the full shape of a tragedy rather than just its most obvious wound. I realized, sitting alone at the table where so many truths had landed in the last week, that the story I had been living with for 30 years, the story of a son who vanished and a mother who was abandoned, was only half the truth, and the other half was murkier, heavier, and far more human. For days afterward, I drifted through my home with a sense of haunting, though not the supernatural kind. It was the haunting of understanding, of suddenly seeing my son not as the villain in a chapter of my life, but as a deeply wounded man who had never learned how to piece himself back together. I didn't absolve him, not for the money, not for the silence, not for the years he stole from me. But I began to feel the edges of my hatred soften, not out of forgiveness, but out of recognition. Recognition that the world is often cruelest to those who have never learned to ask for help, and that my son, for all his faults, had been swallowed by a darkness he never understood. The real escalation, the one I could not escape, came when I received a second envelope, this one from Lily, delivered not by hand, but through the mail. I opened it slowly, bracing myself, and found a letter several pages long in which she finally confessed what she had been too afraid to tell me before. That my son had not died alone after all. That in his final days he had spoken to her mother on the phone, begging to hear the voice of the daughter he had never met. That he had tried to leave messages for Lily that her mother had erased, believing she was protecting their daughter from a man she saw only as a danger. That he had been aware of Lily's existence for years, and that the knowledge had both sustained him and broken him in equal measure. I read that letter slowly, carefully, letting the weight of every sentence settle into me until I felt not shattered, but hollow, as though an emptiness I had carried for decades had suddenly expanded into something vaster and darker than I knew how to contain. It wasn't the betrayal that hurt most. It was the truth that my son had kept reaching for a life he never managed to grasp, that he had wanted to return, that he had wanted to know his child, that he had wanted redemption, and simply never found the strength to achieve it. That night, as the house lay quiet around me, I sat by the window and realized the truth of what had been set in motion. The past was no longer a closed door. It was wide open, its shadows spilling across my present, demanding to be seen, demanding to be understood, demanding to be mourned properly. And I, for the first time in 3 decades, felt myself stepping forward. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but out of a need to finally confront the pieces of my life I had been avoiding for far too long. I woke before dawn on the day I finally decided to act. The sky, still a deep blue bruise, stretched across the horizon, and as I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the coolness of the floor against my feet, I understood with a clarity that startled me. That I could no longer remain in the limbo I had been circling for weeks. No longer pretend that the revelations brought to my doorstep had left me unchanged, because something in me had been pushing outward with a growing insistence, a pressure that felt less like grief and more like the slow forming of courage in a body that had forgotten the sensation altogether. I moved around the house quietly, touching objects I hadn't touched in years, running my fingers across picture frames, opening drawers I had long ignored, not because I expected to find anything new inside them, but because I needed to feel the weight of my own life. The physical reminders that I had existed long before my son disappeared, and that I was still here, still capable of deciding what to do with the remnants he had left me. When I reached the kitchen and saw the envelope lying on the table, softened at the edges from the number of times I had opened and closed it, I felt a strange stillness settle over me, the kind that precedes a moment you cannot undo, and for once, I did not shy away from it. I sat down slowly, unfolded the letter, and reread the final lines, the ones where his handwriting had tilted downward into uneven slants, as if he had been writing through exhaustion or fear or some mixture of both. And something inside me broke in, a way that was not loud or violent, but irrevocably final, the kind of break that rearranges everything within you without spilling a single tear. For 30 years I had lived inside the unfinished sentence of his departure, inside the wound he left open, inside the silence he never dared to break. And now that the truth had arrived in fragments, through his last letter, through the words of a stranger, through the confessions of a daughter he never knew, I understood that the only way forward was not through forgiveness or reconciliation, but through an action that placed a boundary between the life I had lived in grief and the life I might still live without it. I dressed carefully, choosing the navy blouse I had once worn to my husband's memorial service, not because it held any sentimental meaning, but because it made me feel composed, anchored, steady in a way my trembling hands could not guarantee. When I stepped outside, the morning air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of distant rain, something rare in Arizona, but unmistakable, and the sky had begun to soften into pale pink streaks that stretched across the rooftops, like the opening of a curtain before a performance no one had rehearsed for. I walked to the bus stop with a determination I had not felt in decades, my steps slow but unwavering, and boarded the bus heading toward the administrative district, a place I had avoided for years because bureaucracy had always been a reminder of everything I no longer wished to handle. But today, I needed the weight of official spaces, needed the tangible authority of signatures and stamps and documents that could not be unwritten simply because a heart had broken long ago. As the bus rattled along the sunlit streets, I held my purse tightly in my lap, my fingers resting on the outline of the letters inside, and I felt no fear, only a deep, concentrated resolve that surprised me with its steadiness. I walked into the county office with my shoulders straight and my chin lifted slightly, the way I used to walk into parent-teacher conferences when I wanted to appear larger than the doubts I carried. I approached the reception desk, waited in line, and when my turn came, I stated with a calmness that did not match the trembling beneath my ribs that I needed to update my legal records regarding familial next of kin. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, asked for the reason, and instead of flinching or stumbling over excuses, I answered plainly that my son was deceased, and I wished to remove his name from all documents as my emergency contact and beneficiary. The clerk nodded solemnly, handed me forms, and directed me to a quiet corner, unaware of the significance that simple exchange held for me. As I sat filling out each page with slow, deliberate strokes, writing the words deceased, estranged, no surviving parent-child relationship, I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been coiled tightly for so many years that I had forgotten it existed. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was reclamation. With each signature, each line, each box checked, I was not erasing my son, but removing the shadow his absence had cast on my life, removing the silent claim he still held over my future, removing the default authority he had forfeited long before. His heart stopped beating. When I handed the forms back to the clerk and watched him stamp them with an indifferent finality, my knees felt weak, not from grief, but from the overwhelming sense that something inside me had resolved, settled, clicked into place with a clarity I hadn't thought possible. I stepped outside into the sunlight, the heat warm but not oppressive, and felt as though I had walked out of a room I had been trapped in for decades, a room built from memories I hadn't chosen to keep. I didn't go home immediately. Instead, I walked to a small park nearby, sat on a bench beneath a jacaranda tree shedding its violet blossoms onto the pavement, and reached into my purse for the letter. I unfolded it one last time, smoothed it over my knees, and read it aloud quietly, letting the words fall into the open air instead of echoing inside me. When I reached the final sentence, the one where his writing faltered, I closed my eyes and let the moment settle. Let the truth settle. Let the weight of all the years between us settle. Then, with hands that no longer trembled, I tore the letter into small, even pieces, not in anger, but in release, letting the fragments fall into my lap like soft confetti of a life I was finally stepping out of. I sat there for a long while, letting the breeze scatter the pieces at my feet, and for the first time since the moment he left me with nothing but the echo of a careless sentence, I felt something I had not expected to feel again. Not peace, exactly, but spaciousness, a widening of the interior, a quiet opening where pain had lived like a tenant refusing to vacate. I understood then, with a certainty I could taste in the back of my throat, that I had made a decision that could not be undone, that I had closed the last door between myself and the life I had been chained to for far too long, and that whatever came next would be mine to choose. And as I returned home that evening carrying nothing but my purse and the faint scent of jacaranda blossoms on my clothes, and as I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, I realized that the house felt different, not larger or brighter, but somehow clearer, as though a veil that had hung in the air for decades had been lifted and the rooms could finally breathe again. I moved slowly through the quiet space, touching the back of a chair here, the edge of a picture frame there. Not because I was nostalgic, but because I needed to feel the solidity of the life I had begun to reclaim, the life that no longer bent under the weight of what had been taken from me. I sat in my old armchair near the window and let the late afternoon light wash over me in soft golden waves, the same kind of light that used to make me feel older and lonelier. Yet now it felt almost tender, like a presence rather than a reminder of what wasn't there. For a long time, I simply rested my hands on my lap and listened to the subtle sounds of the house settling around me, and I found myself breathing in a rhythm that felt unfamiliar, steady, and unhurried, as though my body had finally remembered how to exist without bracing itself for the next blow. The silence no longer pressed on me like a weight. It unfolded gently, offering room instead of confinement. And in that spacious quiet, I felt a softness enter me that I had not allowed in since the days before my son disappeared. I thought of him then, not with the sharp sting that used to follow his name, but with a subdued recognition that he was woven into the fabric of my life, but no longer in control of its shape, and that this shift, this quiet, irreversible shift, was the true end of the story we had shared. Later, as the sun slipped low and the room dimmed into a wash of muted shadows, I reached for the small note Lily had left me, the one she wrote before she had the courage to tell me everything, and I held it lightly between my fingers, not to reread it, but to acknowledge the thread that now connected us. I realized with a kind of surprised warmth that her presence in my life no longer felt like an intrusion of the past, but like the beginning of something I had never expected to find so late in my years, a connection not built on obligation or sorrow, but on the simple, tender possibility that two people bound by the same history might offer each other a kind of gentle salvation. I understood then that the door I had closed earlier that day was not the last door of my life, only the last door of my grief. When she knocked again 3 days later, just as evening settled into a soft violet haze, her hand hesitant but not fearful, I opened the door without the familiar tightening in my chest, without the instinct to retreat behind silence. She looked at me with those wide, searching eyes that reminded me of a younger version of someone I once knew, and I felt no dread, only a calm curiosity about the future we might learn to shape between us. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where so much of my pain had unfolded, but this time the air felt different, unburdened, as if the walls themselves approved of her return. She spoke softly, as though afraid to disturb the calm she sensed in me. And when she asked whether I was all right, whether she had done the right thing by coming into my life with truths I never sought, I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers, feeling her fingers tremble slightly beneath my touch. I told her the truth. Not the kind meant to comfort, not the kind meant to impress, but the kind that comes from a woman too old to waste words. I told her that pain had lived in this house long enough, that grief had sat at my table like an uninvited guest for 30 years, and that perhaps it was time to offer the seat to someone who wished to bring something other than sorrow. I told her that she did not owe me anything, that I did not expect her to mend what could never be undone, and that if she chose to leave my life again, I would understand. But I also told her that if she wished to stay, if she wished to know me, and to let me know her, then I would receive her with the gentleness I had once reserved for the family I thought I would grow old beside. She began to cry then, quietly, the way people cry when they are relieved rather than broken, and as I squeezed her hand, I felt something settle in me with a soft, decisive certainty that this, here, now, was the quiet aftermath I had long been denied, the kind that doesn't erase the past but allows a person to live beside it without drowning under its echoes. When she finally left that night, promising to return in a few days, I walked her to the door and watched her step into the faded glow of the porch light, her figure outlined against the dimming sky. And for the first time in decades, I felt the Future reached toward me with open hands instead of clenched fists. I closed the door gently, turned off the lights, and stood in the stillness of my small living room, breathing in a sense of peace that did not feel fragile, but earned. And as I prepared for bed, with the cool desert air slipping through the cracked window and the faint sounds of the night rising beyond the walls, I whispered into the quiet a truth I wished someone had told me long ago, that a life can fracture and still find its way to wholeness, that a heart can break and still learn to beat without fear, and that even the oldest wounds can release their hold if you dare to stop carrying them. No one heard me say it. The words drifted into the dimness like dust settling onto forgotten shelves. But for the first time, they belonged fully to me.